It's important to consider our own stories and the stories of others. We all have a story, we're all part of this story. And when we build community to understand each other's stories and even the wider community, if we think of our region and our province, our country, we're all part of this story. So I think incorporating identity into who we are and valuing our story and our identities, and also to imagine the stories that have been handed down through generations and still somehow arrive to us, and a lot of the knowledge that's stored in those stories and is accessible through understanding nature. So we can tell stories about other species as characters, and to allow students that imagination and that freedom and that ability to see the science in a new way, I think is all embodied in story. So story is a really rich way of understanding who we are and where we are.
It also helps when you don't necessarily own the stories to be able to find authentic story that has been published, so you have permission to use it, or that you have been given permission to share from someone else, to help our teacher candidates develop awareness of a concept, of history, of now, of thought into the future. When feeling slightly anxious as educators as to how to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, turn to story.
Story is so much more than a thing. It's not something you read, it's something you live and you are welcomed into and that you make together. My dear friend Richard Wagamis, who has passed away, taught me so much about story and left so much about story in me that I try to pass on and engage with others. Richard wrote that all that we are is story. And so we're creating our stories together, but boy, does that also show what a responsibility we have to honor the stories that are passed to us, to understand the knowledge that's there to teach us. And so stories are often best experienced intergenerationally, where someone who has received that story can share that story, but we're learning about it together, but also recognizing that we're authoring our own stories. That education and being an educator is about self-authorship, and so who we are, we bring all that is in our background, and that's important, but also we are creating a story as an educator with our students. And so what's the story? What's the ethical work that we're trying to do? And even like, how does consent fit into story? Rather than saying, write the story with me, we should be inviting to say, what story could we write? What's important to consider as we create a story? And how do we make sure that all of our voices can be part of those stories, especially those voices that aren't normally heard, because sometimes the way that we hear stories is as part of a grand narrative that's actually kind of problematic. And if we really look, there's so much more to the story than we realize.
So my perspective of the role of story in teaching is that it is integral to forming relationship with others, and that we can learn about each other through story, and sharing our connections when someone tells us their story or a story, and then we can expand the learning and the thinking by sharing our connections. I think it's important for us as educators to be willing to share stories about ourselves that helps our students realize that we have a life outside of school, that we are multifaceted, and that we don't just exist at school. And so to share that we have interests and relationship outside of school, and just so that if we're asking them to share with us who they are and what their stories are, that we are willing to reciprocate as well, and that we are entering into this continual loop of sharing, and then that is going to help us create a learning community and a safe environment and a sense of trust, and that we will be heard and we will be listened to, and we will be seen.
There is story in everything. This is something that I've been taught, I guess, in my connection with Indigenous culture, and where I come from, is that there is story in everything. from being on the land to learning to even what medicines to use, how we hunt, how we gather, how we even share story. And when we share story, there's always story. So there's story, and everything that we do is story.